It was October 1985. The Mediterranean Sea stretched endlessly under a soft golden sunset. The water was calm, almost perfectly still, as if nothing in the world could disturb its peace. Sailing through these quiet waters was a luxury cruise, ship called the Achille Lauro. On board were hundreds of passengers from different parts of the world. Families, couples, and elderly travelers had all come together for one reason: to enjoy a relaxing journey across the sea. The atmosphere on the ship was warm and cheerful. People walked along the decks, enjoying the fresh ocean breeze. Some sat by the railings, watching the waves roll gently below. Others laughed over dinner, shared stories, or took photos to remember the trip. For many, this was a dream vacation. Among the passengers were elderly couples celebrating life, tourists exploring new places, and individuals simply looking for peace away from their busy lives. Everything felt safe. Everything felt normal. But hidden within this calm and happiness was a danger no one could see. Among the passengers were 4 men who seemed just like everyone else. They did not draw attention. They kept to themselves. They watched quietly. To everyone around them, they were just ordinary travelers. But, in reality, they were something very different. They were militants, and they had come on board with a plan, a dangerous plan. Their goal was not to enjoy the journey, but to take control of it. As the ship continued its route, no alarms were raised. No one suspected what was about to happen. The crew carried on with their duties, serving food, guiding passengers, and keeping everything running smoothly. It was just another peaceful day at sea. Then suddenly, everything changed. Without warning, the 4 men revealed their weapons. The calm atmosphere shattered in an instant. Passengers who had been laughing just moments ago were now frozen in fear. Some screamed. Others stood still, unable to understand what was happening. Panic spread quickly across the ship. The men moved fast and with purpose. They shouted orders, forcing people to gather in certain areas. Their voices were loud, aggressive, and filled with control. There was no confusion anymore. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a hijacking. Within minutes, the peaceful cruise ship turned into a place of fear and uncertainty. The hijackers took control of key areas of the ship. They made it clear that they were in charge now. The crew had no choice but to follow their instructions. Passengers were no longer free to move around. They were now hostages. The atmosphere became tense and heavy. Every small sound felt louder. Every movement felt risky. People avoided eye contact with the attackers, hoping not to be noticed. The hijackers had a purpose behind their actions. They were not acting randomly. They began to focus on certain passengers, especially those they believed were Jewish or American. This made the situation even more frightening. People began to worry not just about being hostages, but about being specifically targeted. Among those on board was an elderly American man named Leon Klinghoffer. He was traveling with his wife, hoping to enjoy a peaceful holiday. Leon was disabled and used a wheelchair, making him especially vulnerable in such a situation. Like everyone else, he had no idea that this trip would turn into a nightmare. As time passed, the fear only grew stronger. Passengers whispered quietly to each other, trying to understand what was happening. Some held hands for comfort. Others silently prayed. No one knew how this would end. The hijackers continued to control the ship, watching closely and keeping everyone under pressure. Their demands were not yet fully clear, but one thing was certain. They wanted attention. They wanted the world to notice them. And they were willing to go to extreme lengths to make that happen. The Achille Lauro, once a symbol of luxury and relaxation, had now become something else entirely. A floating prison in the middle of the sea, cut off from safety, surrounded by uncertainty. And as the ship drifted across the Mediterranean, carrying fear instead of joy, the world outside was just beginning to realize what was unfolding. What had started as a peaceful journey was now turning into an international crisis, and this was only the beginning. As the hours passed on board the Achille Lauro, the situation grew more serious. Fear was everywhere. Passengers sat quietly, afraid to move, afraid to speak. The laughter and joy that once filled the ship had completely disappeared. In its place was silence and tension. The hijackers kept a close watch on everyone. They walked through the hallways with weapons in their hands, making sure no one stepped out of line. Every small movement felt dangerous. Even looking in the wrong direction could bring unwanted attention. Families stayed close together. Strangers comforted each other in whispers. Some people prayed quietly, hoping this nightmare would end soon. But things were about to get much worse. The hijackers became more aggressive. They wanted their message to be heard by the world. They wanted attention, and they were ready to use fear to get it. Then came the moment that changed everything. An elderly, American passenger, Leon Klinghoffer, was singled out. He was in a wheelchair, unable to move on his own. He posed no threat to anyone, yet he became a target. In a shocking act of violence, he was murdered by the hijackers. It was a cruel and senseless act. When news of his death later reached the world, it caused outrage and deep sadness. People everywhere were horrified. This was no longer just a hijacking. It had become an act of terror. Back on the ship, fear reached a new level. Passengers realized that their lives were truly in danger. Meanwhile, outside the ship, governments were beginning to react. Italy, Egypt, and the United States were all drawn into the crisis. Each country had a role to play, and each had its own concerns. Italy, as the country connected to the ship, took the lead in handling the situation. Egypt became involved as a possible location for negotiations. The United States became deeply concerned, especially after the murder of an American citizen. The situation was no longer just happening on a ship. It had become an international crisis. Negotiations began. Officials worked quickly, trying to find a way to end the hijacking without more loss of life. Talks were tense and complicated. Every decision carried risk. The hijackers made demands, hoping to gain something from the situation. They wanted safe passage. They wanted to escape. After long discussions, an agreement seemed possible. The hijackers agreed to leave the ship in exchange for being allowed to fly out safely. For the passengers, this felt like a moment of hope. The nightmare might finally be ending. The hijackers left the Achille Lauro and boarded a plane, expecting to escape. But the story was far from over. The plane flew through the night sky. Something unexpected happened. The United States made a bold move. U.S. Navy fighter jets were sent to intercept the plane. In a dramatic and dangerous operation, the jets surrounded the aircraft and forced it to change course. It was a high-risk moment. One wrong move could have led to disaster. The plane was forced to land at Sigonella, air base in Italy, and that's where the tension reached its peak. American forces were ready to take control and arrest the hijackers immediately. But Italian authorities stepped in. They insisted that the hijackers would be handled under Italian law. Soon, armed soldiers from both sides stood facing each other on the runway. Weapons were ready. Voices were tense. The situation could have turned into a military confrontation at any second. This moment became known as the Sigonella crisis. For a brief time, it seemed like two allies might come into conflict over how to handle the situation. But in the end, no shots were fired. Italy stood firm and took custody of the hijackers. The standoff ended peacefully, but the tension left a lasting mark. What started as a hijacking had now grown into a global political crisis, and the world was watching closely to see what would happen next. After the tense standoff at Sigonella Air Base, the crisis slowly began to move toward its final stage. The hijackers were now in custody. Italy took control of the situation and prepared to bring them to justice under its own legal system. The world was watching closely. This was not just about a crime. It had become a matter of international importance. The trial began in Italy. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was serious and heavy. The men responsible for the hijacking and the murder of Leon Klinghoffer stood before judges, facing the consequences of their actions. Evidence was presented. Witnesses spoke. The story of what happened on board the Achille Lauro was told in detail. For many, it was painful to hear. The fear, the chaos, and the loss were still fresh in people's minds. The court carefully examined each role in the hijacking. Not all the attackers were treated the same. Some were seen as more responsible than others, especially for the violence that took place. In the end, the hijackers were found guilty. They received prison sentences, though the length of those sentences varied. For the families of the victims, it was a step toward justice, but it could never undo what had already happened. However, one important figure was still missing. The mastermind behind the operation, a man known as Abbas, had not been immediately captured. He was believed to have helped plan the hijacking from behind the scenes. While the attackers were arrested, he managed to avoid facing justice for many years. This caused frustration and anger, especially for those who wanted full accountability. For a long time, Abbas moved between countries, staying out of reach, but the story did not end there. Years later, he was finally captured by United States forces during a military operation. It was a long-awaited moment. However, before he could face a full trial, he died while in American custody. His death brought a quiet and somewhat unresolved end to his role in the story. Meanwhile, the Achille Lauro itself continued to sail for several years after the incident. But its legacy had changed forever. What was once known as a luxury cruise ship was now remembered for tragedy. Then, in 1994, nearly a decade after the hijacking, the ship faced its final fate. A fire broke out on board while it was at sea. The situation quickly got out of control. Despite efforts to save it, the ship eventually sank into the ocean. It was the end of the Achille Lauro. A vessel that had once carried joy and celebration now rested beneath the waves, forever linked to one of the most shocking hijackings in modern history. The events of 1985 left a deep impact on the world. This was more than just a crime on a ship. It showed how a single act of violence could affect multiple nations at once. It exposed weaknesses in security, especially in international travel. As a result, countries began to rethink their safety measures. Maritime security became stronger. Rules were changed. Governments improved how they respond to threats like hijacking and terrorism. But beyond the policies and politics, there was a human story. Innocent people had suffered. A life was lost. Families were changed forever. The fear experienced on that ship was something survivors would never forget. Even today, the story of the Achille Lauro is remembered. It stands as a warning, a reminder of how quickly peace can turn into chaos, and how important it is for nations to work together in times of crisis. Because in a world so connected, one event in the middle of the sea can send shockwaves across the entire globe, and sometimes the actions of just a few people can leave a mark on history that is never erased.